I'm back for the second round of Boundaries Part 2. Today we're going to be talking about rigid boundaries. So I want to welcome everybody, whether you were with me live or watching the replay. Please comment below and let me know you're here. I'll also be asking for comments later too, so chime in. I want to hear from you. Because I don't know who might be watching at some point, I want to go ahead and introduce myself again. I'm Bonnie Barclay, a therapist in Knoxville, Tennessee. Feel free to grab something to write with. I really want you to leave with some takeaways again today for your own personal growth. Let me check and see, get everybody just a minute to see who's here. And we'll get started. There are three types of boundaries that we started talking about last time. Porous or weak boundaries, which we talked about last week, and then rigid and healthy boundaries. So again, today we're going to talk about rigid boundaries. Remember, we talked about last time that most people have a mix of boundaries, kind of depending on the situation and the relationship. For example, healthy at work and a combination of maybe rigid and weak with family or romantic relationships. So, are your boundaries too rigid? If so, the goal is to understand today the protective intention or stance with that and how to have more flexibility to have better connections, to feel less isolated and alone. So let's check in if you have weak boundaries. I'm going to fire off some questions again like I did last time, and we'll see which ones you can relate to. I'll just walk through these slowly. So if you're writing, you have a minute to kind of check in and see what you're connecting with. Do you have difficulty trusting others? Do things need to be done your way? Are you reluctant to share or be vulnerable? Are you quick to shut people out of your life? Do you often feel misunderstood? Do you avoid intimacy in close relationships, preferring more surface level relationships? Have you been described as detached, even by romantic partners? Do you tend to keep others at a distance? Do you tend to pride yourself on self-sufficiency, not needing others? And last, do you have a strong need to be in control? So when you hear these questions, comment yes below if you can relate. I know that means you're probably outing yourself, but usually people around you probably know that you struggle with that anyway. And remember, we're a mix, so probably all of us do, and have different situations where we can be rigid. So when we have rigid boundaries, we create too much space between ourselves and others. A rigid boundary is like a big, strong wall. It feels safe. Walls are good protection, but it keeps everyone out. So we become isolated and disconnected. Remember from last time in the talk on weak boundaries, people often have a combination, like we've said, and many people vacillate between boundaries that are too weak and too rigid. For example, you might have a pattern where you don't set enough boundaries and then you get hurt, and then you tend to overcompensate with rigid boundaries for a while. You could also have weak boundaries with your family and rigid boundaries at work. In any case, people who struggle with boundaries often have a combination. Rigid boundaries commonly serve as a protection from vulnerability. Those with rigid boundaries generally fear too much closeness. So what is it they're afraid of? Close relationships may be frightening for a variety of reasons. They may fear a loss of independence or autonomy, hurt, other loss, rejection, disappointment, being let down, and of course the pain associated with all of these. Those with rigid boundaries often value self-sufficiency, and our culture supports that in many ways. As another protective layer, that self-sufficiency is part of that wall. If you only rely on yourself, you can avoid all the hurt we just named. These folks don't like that distance. Many crave connection with others while simultaneously fearing such closeness. These patterns are often rooted in childhood. And I know I said that last time. This isn't about parent blame or childhood blame, but any circumstance, whether it's from our family of origin, circumstances at school, things growing up that happen, we develop certain skills, survival skills that were useful at the time, but now they're no longer serving you. Rigid boundaries make us independent of our partner if we're talking about a marital relationship. They allow us to feel self-directed but not connected. Okay, so where do you start with this solution? First, the key decision is whether or not you will compromise, putting relationship before being right. This does not mean giving in, shifting into passivity, placating, or pleasing, like we talked about last week. This can be hard. Remember that self-sufficiency thing? It takes time to consider others, lean into others, and even count on others. This will push up against a rigid boundary setter's survival instincts, the way that they're used to functioning. And remember, it's going to trigger that fear. So part of that decision of compromising is also is leaning into distress, being able to tolerate the distress that will go along with compromise. Gottman talks about temporary or ongoing compromise and how essential this is in times of stuck conflict or gridlock. John and Julie Gottman are gurus in terms of relationship and marriage. You'll want to show more interest in your partner as another part of this solution. Share more of yourself with them. But in order to feel safe enough to do so, like them, you too have to become really good at putting down boundaries too. Remember, this will come out of our values and then our priorities, same as we talked about last week for others. Healthy boundaries are all about balance, helping the other person and ourselves feel loved and connected, while at the same time feeling that we have a sense of individuality and agency, which is key for rigid boundary setters. But sharing is scary. You have to start small and build. The other key to this is knowing the capacity and skill set of the person that you're sharing with. I think this is really important and often missed. So when I talk to my clients about sharing with people and trying to determine who's safe and who's not safe to share and at what level, there's two things I talk about. I talk about skill groups and I talk about Matthew Kelly's 7 levels of intimacy. So let's start with the skill groups. The 3 groups are the teachable people. These are the folks that may not know what to do when you set boundaries with them. They don't know how to communicate well. They have skill deficits, but they are truly committed to learning. These people may fail you and hit up against those raw spots or those wounds from childhood, but that's not their intention. And they really want to learn how to love and be in relationship with you. And those are the good ones. You then have someone who struggles with skills, maybe even struggle with the desire or motivation to learn, or they struggle just to learn, but they are very responsive to firm boundaries. Not the rigid boundaries, but clear and firm boundaries of the rules of engagement in that relationship. And those folks also can be workable. Where I see clients struggling with that is when they feel like that they get tired or drained with setting boundaries. And then that can move into the 3rd level, which is toxic. Those are people that are not really invested in change, whether they have the skills or not. It's just not something that they're wanting to change or work on. And that becomes a decision point for my clients of what they want to do about those relationships. But that's probably another topic all in and of itself. So given that, and once you determine kind of what is the skill set of this person, then you can begin to navigate the level of sharing that and what you want to open up about. Realistic expectations become a win-win. Different people can meet different needs. You don't have to put all your eggs in one basket. Matthew Kelly's seven Levels of Intimacy is a good guide, and I'm going to be talking about that in more detail next week, but I want to just briefly give you a glimpse. He talks about that our essential purpose, the purpose of our life, is to become the best version of ourselves. And intimacy is sharing the journey to become that best version of ourselves with another person. Sharing is about vulnerability and it's about intimacy. Intimacy is a need. You can survive without it, but you cannot thrive and become the best version of yourself without intimacy. So, just briefly to go over the 7 levels, the top level is cliches, then facts, opinions, hopes and dreams, feelings, weaknesses and fears, and then needs. And so you can see the varying levels of degree of closeness and being open and sharing as you move down those. Now, this is not one of these check and go linear types of process. It really ebbs and flows depending on the relationship. But we'll talk more about that and how you can use this to guide yourself into what you want to be open with, where your boundaries can be more flexible, which is the goal of a rigid boundary setter. That flexibility, psychological flexibility, and boundary flexibility. So, what's my hard truth for today? Because I did that last time, we're going to do it this time. You have to decide, to all you rigid boundary setters, you have to decide, is the discomfort worth it to connect in a healthy way with other people? To risk the discomfort that you may lose someone. You may lose some of your independence to be connected and in relationship. You may get hurt. You may be disappointed. You may be let down. So, what are the takeaways for today? I want you to think about, can you identify one person who you would like to show up with, to show more interest in, to share more about yourself? The next one. Are there areas where you recognize you can get rigid or need to be right? And can you show more flexibility and movement towards a compromise in that area? Third, do you recognize areas where you can put down your own boundaries, not a wall to keep people out, more the sliding glass door where you can see out? You can open and close it and have that power and control, allowing trusted people in and still allowing for your own protection. Do you have a boundary setter you know who can support you as you make these shifts? And in closing, I'm going to give you a quote that really resonated with me and resonates with many of my clients by Harville Hendricks. We are born in relationship. We are wounded in relationship. And we can be healed in relationship. Thanks, you guys. So good to be here with you today. And just leave any comments if you have any other questions. And I'll see you next week. Thanks so much. Bye.